Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday evening. My name is Mr. Lagerway. I'm coming to you live from Holland, Michigan. And hopefully wherever you are, you're in the mood for some APUSH. Tonight we're covering period 6. And so let's jump in. Before we get too much into that, and as I'm sharing my screen, a couple of reminders for you. One, there is an ask a question function down below. That would be fairly useful. Otherwise, feel free to go and hit it in the chat and write things down there too. Just to make sure that everything's working okay, everybody can hear me, go ahead and drop a 1 through 5 in the chat, please, in terms of how you're feeling about period 6. 1 being like, I'm not sure what period 6 is, and a 5 being, I got this. I memorized this long ago, and this is old hat for me. I'm on period 9 or something like that. But if you can give me a quick 1 to 5 in the chat, how we're doing, see who's here, see how we're doing, see how we're feeling about this subject as a whole. That'll get us started with some preliminaries. Let's see, Angelina's saying about a 3.5, so we're somewhere in the middle, but I'm tending toward the good side. I like it. I'm kind of a glass half full kind of person. A glass half full kind of person. Got to be careful there. I haven't finished it in class yet. Okay, Dylan's feeling a good 4. Excellent. That's always good. We're getting there. My class is finishing up period 6 right now, and we're having a test on it next week. But, you know, everybody's in different places, so I wouldn't feel stressed no matter where you are. Let's see, Dylan's class is on World War II right now. All right, so it's been a while. Okay, yeah, we're all in different places, right? We all have different kinds of schedules. We all have different kinds. Dylan, you must be from New Jersey, right? Because you have that 2-year sequence with APUSH. That's pretty cool. And then, yeah, let's jump into a couple things. So, just a reminder, we got ourselves weekly streams, and so the reason we're going live now at 9 p.m. is that this is the time that APUSH happens. 9 p.m. on Thursdays. European history is happening at the same time. Not a lot of people take APUSH in Euro, but we're at 9 p.m. So if you want more APUSH content, come on back here Thursdays, 9 p.m., and we'll get you covered with Fiveable. A couple of reminders about upcoming APUSH ones. Specifically, we got ourselves U.S. imperialism, and so Zoe will be covering World War I in just a week. I believe I'm doing that one as well, if I remember correctly. Then we got the Progressive Era and other parts of World War I. We kind of put World War I in both places. And then we got the 1920s and 30s coming up, so we should have you covered for the next couple of sections. And Dylan, hopefully, will catch up with you at some point. And then just remember, if you want to get notified by these things, it's always a good idea to follow Fiveable on social media. So go ahead and do that on your favorite ones. Fizz is talking about the Gilded Age and political cartoons. Excellent. We'll be looking at some of those tonight. You're right where we are. Sounds good. So again, a couple of reminders. One, that there is a ask a question function at the bottom. There's also the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to use either of those. If you would like to use the chat function and then upvote certain ones that you like, feel free to do that. They'll kind of rise to the top that way. Otherwise, I'll try to address things kind of more as we go in the chat. But if you have big questions you want to make sure that we get covered, Dylan's already asked one about the Gilded Age and foreign policy. We'll address that at some point. But if you have other ones that are big questions, feel free to put those in the ask a question function. Otherwise, here's what we got going on tonight. We're going to be talking about the rise of industry and capitalism because period 6 is full of the second industrial revolution. Then we're going to be talking about immigration and migration, so people moving around into the United States, around the United States, and what the United States even is going to be a little bit interesting. Then we're going to talk about cultural, economic, and social debates. It's kind of a catch-all category that the College Board likes to use to talk about, oh man, a bunch of things changed during this time period. What's it like? What happens? We're going to have some review short answer questions or SAQs embedded throughout, and we're going to have a time for questions and answers at the end, along with some bonus political cartoons and images if we have time. But of course, again, if you have questions, please ask them as we go. The more that you interact with me, the better this goes, the more I'm able to tailor what we're talking about to you and what you need, and the more you're able to make sure that this is useful for you. So let's see. Dylan was talking about biggest area of confusion is probably with Gilded Age politics. It's all starting to blend into a history soup and having trouble picking out specific details. We're going to talk about Gilded Age politics in terms of domestic front and a couple different kinds of parties. Period 6 is a bit of a history soup and a big hot mess. Some of it you need to worry about, some of what you don't. In terms of foreign policy, just to answer the question that you initially had, actually, Gilded Age foreign policy is I don't want to say virtually non-existent because that doesn't give us enough credit. But for the APUSH purposes, you largely don't have to know a whole lot. The United States continues to expand its reach toward Asia. So remember in the 1850s, we had the United States with Matthew Perry getting involved in Japan. We have the United States casting its eye toward Hawaii, trying to make sure the British stay out of Hawaii. The United States has manifested all of the destiny during period 6, and so they feel like they've controlled the entire North American continent. They start to look abroad a little bit more, start to look for more trade. There's a little bit of the start to imperialism with Latin Americans, partly because the United States has been imperializing Native Americans for quite a while, of course. But otherwise, the United States is fairly isolationist, although some historians would disagree with that. They would call it unilateralist, as in the United States doesn't engage with other countries. We just do our own thing. So we weren't engaging with other countries, just not together. And we weren't, say, a major European power. In fact, it's during the Gilded Age that the United States starts to upgrade its ministers to ambassadors. It's foreign emissaries. It's people representing the United States in other countries. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, they do that first, and then we upgrade ours. So the United States starts to get more involved in world diplomacy, but it's still pretty basic at this point. We'll get to more of the domestic policies a little bit later. So here we go. Let's get into this. First thing, we have the rise of industrial capitalism. So bonus point for tonight, who can tell me either A, what that invention is on the right-hand side of your screen, or B, who that gentleman is with the mustache on the right side of your screen? Angelina guesses Carnegie. It's a great guess. It's a great guess. It's a little bit misleading because the invention has to do with steel. Dylan, you got it. It's the Bessemer process as shown in England, and that is Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. Some think he is the richest American of all time. Carnegie looks a little bit different, a little more white, kind of beardish looking guy. He's involved with steel. Rockefeller's involved with oil, kind of mixed those two up. So apologies for misleading people that guessed incorrectly. So let's dive into this a little bit. We're going to cover just a brief overview. You need to be able to explain things like the effects of technology. You need to be able to explain the socioeconomic changes from tech. So technology doesn't just cause the United States to stay the same. And also the government responses to the rise of industrial capitalism. So those are our big 3 topics for this subtopic. Let's dive in. So the effects of technology. First of all, we have a lot of power. And by power, I don't mean political power, but I mean literal horsepower kind of thing, things you would measure in physics class. And so one of the important things to realize about the Gilded Age is that it sees the Industrial Revolution really start to take off in terms of power. It's even beyond what we've seen before with things like the Lowell Mills and using water power and water wheels and things like that. So we're starting to see moving from water usage in the New England textile mills to using steam-powered engines. We start to move from using wood to keep homes heated or lit to using kerosene. Again, think Standard Oil. We start to move from using horses to using engines, which are still measured in horsepower because they used to be compared to horses. So there's a lot of different kinds of sources of power that are shifting. That's worth knowing. And the Gilded Age is full of lots of inventions that make those things possible. Some of them are imported from England. You've taken AP World History before. You know all about that, England's industrialization and coal and ghost colonies and all that stuff. We're touching on that in AP World as well right now. Then there's a variety of other technologies that are going to change the United States. So new inventions and innovations. Let me give you some examples. We already mentioned the Bessemer process. That's going to be involved in making steel a whole lot cheaper. Andrew Carnegie is going to be famous for using that. He imports it from England, and then he continues to use this to refine his steel mills, making them better, faster, more efficient. And this increased steel production is going to lead to 2 things, one of which is urbanization, because they're able to build skyscrapers and other such things that use steel, but also railroads. Railroads are huge. Railroads are a big deal, and as John Green says, underrated in monopoly and underrated in American history. You got to know railroads during this time period, especially because they're an example of monopoly with Cornelius Vanderbilt, and they tie in with the steel process, and they lead to urbanization because now people can travel all over the place. We're going to see vertical and horizontal integration. Now, I got a picture there of vertical and horizontal integration, and there's a variety of ways of thinking about it. It's a good idea to just memorize this. Vertical integration is going to be where you own one part of each step of the process, so you don't have to pay anyone else. The classic example is U.S. Steel and Carnegie. He owns the steel mills. He owns the steel itself that's made out of iron, made out of coke that makes the iron into steel. So he owns every step of the process. Then horizontal integration is owning all parts of one step of the process. The classic example would be Standard Oil and Rockefeller. in the sense that Standard Oil is the refinery, and you basically have to go through them. He doesn't own all the oil fields, at least initially. He doesn't own all the gas stations, at least initially, but he owns all the refineries, and so you have to go through him. So inventions and innovations aren't just things that inventors can create patents for. They're also new ways of organizing corporations, new ways of organizing businesses during this time period. Could they ask us to directly compare Carnegie and Rockefeller on the exam, or would a comparison essay be more broad? I believe so. Yeah, someone feel free to double check the exact wording in the concept outline, but I'm pretty sure the concept outline does not list them specifically as people you must know, more like they're examples. Vertical and horizontal integration even is an example of business innovations. So if it's not specifically listed in the concept outline, they can't require you to know it on the exam. They can just highly suggest that you use it. So I don't think you'd have one that specifically compares the two guys. You might have an essay, I'd say, that says something like, briefly describe one way business changed during the Gilded Age, or a new invention, or something that was controversial. I'm not even sure they would necessarily give you a compare-contrast, but you might be able to talk about a CCOT essay. If they talk about economic practices during the Gilded Age, then absolutely mentioning those would be a good idea. Yeah. Some other inventions and innovations during this time period, we get middle management. So there's no longer this, master and apprentices that we saw during the medieval era or even earlier in American history. It's even no longer even an owner and his workers. The corporations are getting so large that they start to need middle managers. So we need people that manage on the daily level. And then you have the people that actually own the factories. They don't necessarily interact with their bosses. So there's a little bit of a social disconnect between bosses and their workers. This is going to lead to all sorts of fun things like strikes and violence and problems. We'll see that. Corporations also start to change. We start to get them using monopolies and trusts. Standard Oil is the classic example of this. Eventually gets broken up after some muckraking by Ms. Ida Tarbell. But monopolies and trusts, you can use those somewhat interchangeably. This is not AP economics. We don't need to talk about all the details there. But monopoly limits competition by creating unfair advantage where one person owns everything. A trust is basically where a bunch of companies coordinate their prices, and thus, you're not able to compete fairly either. Either way, those are seen as unfair competition and seen as ways to be able to limit competition, to make money for the rich people and to hurt the consumer. So the workers are going to fight back against that. Things like Singer sewing machines, there are some just straight up inventions. Singer sewing machines are going to lead to things like ready-made clothing that people can wear. It's going to lead to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and the subsequent fire that occurs there. So be aware of things like that, just some examples. And then there's also a consumer culture that starts to rise. This will increase in the 1920s for those of you that are around there. But otherwise, this consumer culture of, okay, I'm going to buy things, not necessarily be self-sufficient in sort of a yeoman, gentleman, farmer, Thomas Jefferson way, that starts to go away. So we have some big changes that come from this technology, and you may recognize this cartoon. This shows the trusts that are taking over the Senate. It's called the bosses of the Senate, not the people, but the money. So some of the changes, some are positive, some are negative. Women and children begin to go in the workforce more and more. Women are still doing a lot of these stereotypical things like being secretaries, being teachers, but they are getting increased opportunities, something that's going to be a theme in American history. And unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of children in the workforce as well. And child labor is going to be an important thing that the progressives try to tackle later. We're also going to see the standard of living increases. Again, the Gilded Age is full of a lot of really good things and a lot of really bad things, right? The term gilded itself means covered with a thin layer of gold, right? So it looks really good on the outside, but on the inside, it's full of muck and nastiness and corruption and racism. Standard of living does increase. Goods get cheaper. They're made more efficiently. People are able to buy more. As standards of living increase, that's partly thanks to, I guess you'd call them captains of industry in this case, and their innovative business practices and their high-quality items. Now, standard of living increasing doesn't mean for everyone, of course, and so you're going to have to make sure you pay attention to the margins, as we always should in history. And you want to make sure that you also know that standards of living increasing doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's happier, because sometimes the keeping up with the Joneses that we talked about last slide means that they want to buy more and more and more. We're going to see these people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie Steel, Rockefeller Oil, Morgan, JP Morgan is a famous banker. They're going to be considered robber barons or captains of industry. Again, not a lot of questions are going to be asked on this directly, where it's like compare and contrast robber barons and captains of industry. That's a little bit too simplistic. But you should definitely be able to know the difference between the two. Robber barons are people that exploit workers. They cheat. They do anything to get money. Captains of industry help provide jobs. They're the job creators. They're the ones that donate lots of money. They're really helpful. And it turns out that most people are pretty mixed. Some people are pretty terrible, like your Jay Gould, but a lot of them are a pretty mixed bag. And people like Carnegie, right, try to buy their way out of the label of robber baron by donating lots of money, by donating church organs, by donating lots of libraries and things like that. So philanthropy becomes a big deal. Gospel of Wealth, that Carnegie essay that he's pretty famous for. We also get things like Taylorism. This is otherwise known as scientific management. So this is the idea of, okay, you're becoming a cog in the machine. You are just merely a small piece of this potentially assembly line type item that's going on. Taylorism is scientific management to make workers more efficient, and that starts to change workers' relationship with their work. And then we get things again like trust and monopolies we already talked about. And then the workers start to fight back, partly against the consolidation of wealth that's happening, partly against the power, the exploitation that they see, partly against Taylorism that seems to take away their individual autonomy or ability to make their own decisions. So things like the railroad strike of 1877, led by Eugene V. Debs, the Homestead strike, the Pullman strike, the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor. You should know some of these. You don't have to know all of them, but you should be able to pull up a couple of really good examples of items where the workers fight back. And the Knights of Labor versus the American Federation of Labor, not bad to know. Knights of Labor a lot more inclusive, but kind of fall apart after the Haymarket riot because they're blamed for a lot of the violence. American Federation of Labor springs up in its absence, but not nearly as inclusive, especially along racial lines. So workers begin to fight back. They form unions. They go on strike. That's the main tool they have to fight back. Unfortunately, the government usually takes the side of the big businesses. We'll talk about that later. So moving on, speaking of government responses, we have a picture right there of the government militia going in to be able to settle the Homestead strikes, so the Pennsylvania militia getting called in. Again, there's a variety of reasons for this, which we'll get to. But allegedly, and you'll hear this term, laissez-faire, right? Hands off. It's a French phrase, right? That means the government's not doing anything. This is not entirely true, and it's a bit of a myth that the government was laissez-faire during the Gilded Age. But for our purposes, we can say that the government did not regulate a whole lot of business, but it wasn't laissez-faire in terms of it did side with the with the business leaders against the workers quite frequently, especially when there were strikes and things like that. So laissez-faire politics, it's kind of complicated. Usually taking the side of big businesses, usually through using troops to put down strikes, as you can see there in Homestead. And then there was the Sherman Antitrust Act, right, which was passed, and it was supposed to be able to limit trusts and limit big business, but it outlawed anything that got in the way of business. And it turns out that unions going on strike can interfere with business, so then people start to use it to attack unions, which was not its original intent, but it happens anyway. So that's a bit of a problem for workers. And then there are some imperialist adventures. You're going to look more into period 7 to see this. But one of the government responses to all this increased production and these new inventions is to say, hey, we got to be able to sell these in various places. How about in China? How about overseas? And so that kind of blends into period 7, which begins in 1890. There's a little bit of an overlap there. So some practice questions. But before we get to the practice questions, let me pause for a second. I've been talking for a while. Do you have any questions on the stuff we've covered so far? Again, this is not meant to be a deep dive into the Gilded Age. It's supposed to be a quick review, a quick overview of some of the things hopefully you've either already covered or it's a quick preview of the things you're going to cover in your class to make you feel a little bit better. Any questions that you have so far, go ahead and, again, bring them up in the Ask a Question function down below. Put them in the chat. Otherwise, I got some practice short answer questions that we can take a look at and go along. So, briefly describe one specific way the United States government intervened in the economy from 1865 to 1900. Let's open it up to the chat. What's one specific way the U.S. government intervened in the economy from 1865 to 1900? While I'm waiting for your replies, Fizz asked a question, do you think Boss Tweed will come up? Absolutely could be. Yeah, Boss Tweed's been on previous exam questions, I believe. And it's not going to be an entire DBQ on Boss Tweed, but we'll actually talk about that in a later section. Talking about machine politics, government corruption, political machines, Thomas Nast and muckrakers against people like Boss Tweed during the Gilded Age, absolutely. Not a bad thing to know. Just a really good example. Boss Tweed was, again, a person who was in charge of the New York City Democratic machine. So he controlled New York City Democratic politics, and he was in charge. There was a lot of sketchy money stuff going on where he would make lots of money through government contracts, and the patronage system, kind of like the spoils system of Andrew Jackson, where, hey, new immigrant, come and vote for me. I'll find you a job and vote for me. Did I mention vote for me? That kind of thing. So Boss Tweed was famous for being pretty corrupt. Cartoonist Thomas Nast, we'll actually see one of his later. He was famous for trying to take him down because he thought he was corrupt. And so he would draw some cartoons that would show Thomas Nast would draw cartoons that showed that Boss Tweed was corrupt and helped to bring him down, actually. All right. So if you think you have an answer to letter A, go ahead and put it in there. Christine says federal land grants in the West. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The Homestead Act, the Moral Land Grant Act, we'll actually get to their next section. I tried to organize this according to the big themes of the concept outline, but they kind of overlap, right? So absolutely, that would very much work. So nice job. That works. Let's look at a couple of other ones. Let's see. We also have some questions that we'll get to in a little bit. More of a general, Dylan's got one. More of a general APUSH question. How important are minute details? I know it's more specific than WAP, but how specific must we get? Yeah, that's one of those things. As somebody that teaches both, I often tell students that APUSH is more specific than WAP. You have that correct. I would say just get as specific as you can. So at APUSH, you want to be mentioning specific people. You want to be mentioning specific laws. If you can mention specific dates, that's even better. But you don't necessarily have to. It kind of depends on the question, right? So if it's a question about Reconstruction, dates are a little bit more important. If it's the Gilded Age, it gets a little fuzzy. If it's the Gilded Age politics, you probably don't need to know all the presidents. My personal opinion is that presidents after Rutherford B. Hayes until about McKinley or so are kind of take it or leave it. So you're at your Benjamin Harrisons, your James Garfield, sorry, all those people. Grover Cleveland, not worth spending a ton of time on. Could be useful, but don't like pull your hair out trying to memorize them all. Could be helpful. But when it comes to APUSH in general, I would just say, again, be able to give some specific examples to all the big questions. So, for instance, this one, government involvement in the U.S. economy. You could talk about the Sherman Antitrust Act and then give an example. You could mention the Homestead Act and then talk about how that's out west. Or you could talk about the Transcontinental Railroad and how that goes out west. Or how the United States Army, like militia and National Guard often gets called out to be able to suppress strikes. That'd be one example. And then just continue to work from there. Strikes, you don't have to know them all, but you should be able to recognize some of them if you see them, and also be able to use at least one of them to answer a short answer question. Let's go to another short answer question here. And again, keep the questions coming if you have them. So letter B, describe one specific way business leaders consolidated power between 1865 and 1900. Just again, as you're thinking about the answer to this question, 1865 is the end of the Civil War. 1900 is a nice round date that they like to use. The Gilded Age can go in a variety of areas. Some people cut it off at 1890. Some people cut it off in 1898 with imperialism. Some people cut it off in 1914 with the rise of World War I. Some people cut it off in 1920 with the end of the Progressive Era, and they say they kind of overlap. Doesn't really matter. Just pay attention to those dates and don't mention something that's too late. So you wouldn't want to mention the progressive presidents here. But a specific way that business leaders consolidated power. See if you got something that you can throw in the chat there to answer that question. I'll throw out one more. Briefly describe one specific way workers fought for their rights between 1865 and 1900. So Dylan, you got an answer for B, absolutely. Horizontal and vertical integration to build monopolies, grow trusts. Fizz is answering letter C. Yes, strikes and unions would be a really good idea. I would mention one specific one. So say Homestead Strike or American Federation of Labor. Something like that would be a good idea. And then you folks have heard of the ACE method before. I like to use that with my students when it comes to short answer questions. And you can quibble on the different kinds of acronyms and how useful they are. But again, your big thing with short answer questions, use vocab, define the vocab, tell me why I should care. So the Homestead Strike, which was a way that workers fought against Carnegie in the steel industry, is an example of workers fighting back after Carnegie refused to give them a wage increase and actually decrease their wages. Something like that. So ACE, answer, cite, explain. However you want to think about that, the big thing is you got to have a vocab word. You have to define what it is and tell me why I should care. Again, you want to write as if the person reading doesn't know a whole lot, and you need to make them absolutely positive that you know what you're talking about. So you don't want to stay general and say unions. You want to say the American Federation of Labor. And then you don't want to just say that. You want to say, okay, what is that? Right? Let's see. And Dylan, nice job. That's good. Like, yeah, I would say maximum 3 sentences per part. So 2 to 3 for A, 2 to 3 for B, 2 to 3 for C. If you're taking longer than that, you're not doing it right, perhaps, unless you write really short sentences, I suppose. But you want to move the heck along because you got 3 of these to write. You don't have all day, and you want to get to the point, right? Just do it. Let's see. Triangle short with factory fire to promote better factory conditions. Yes, Jenna, that'd be fantastic. By the way, shout out to Jenna from my class. That'd be a fantastic answer if it went until 1920. A reminder that that happens in 1911, I believe. So it might be a little bit past the time period, but you could absolutely use that. That you get fire escapes, you get sprinkler systems, doors that open outward, all that good stuff. Absolutely. Let's go on to the next section. Again, continue to do more. Let's see. Bribing government officials, heavily promoting their desired presidential candidate. Yeah, that's going to happen a variety of times. In 1896, there's going to be heavy money behind McKinley. That's one of the most famous because as a percentage of GDP, it's pretty high. So next section is on immigration and migration, how people move around. Big 3 things here: westward expansion and settlement, immigration and push-pull factors. Let's just dive in. Sorry, there's only 2. So westward expansion. We got this famous picture here. Can anyone tell me what that picture is? If you know what it is, or you think you know what it is, throw it in the chat. I'll give you a hint while you're writing it down. They left out all of the Chinese workers and deliberately pushed them aside so they could take this picture. Darn racism striking again. It's not miners. Dylan, you're killing it, man. All right. Yeah, this is Promontory Point, Utah. This is the coming together of the 2 different railroads, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. This is the Transcontinental Railroad and the famous Golden Spike. So if you haven't learned about it yet, this is talking about westward expansion, the first Transcontinental Railroad going from Sacramento to Omaha, and this is where they finally met. It lined up. They put in a ceremonial golden spike, and they took a big picture. Not a contest. It's okay. So the Transcontinental Railroad is a huge deal, right? It transforms the way Americans think. You can now go across the continent in as little as a couple days as opposed to months and months. You don't have to risk everything on a wagon train anymore. It results in the creation of time zones because people move so fast. We have Sears selling things through the railroad, through the mail order catalog. We have more and more settlers going out west. We're going to know more and more about we're going to see more and more bison getting destroyed because hunters come out west on the railroad, right? So the Transcontinental Railroad transforms everything it touches, and it leads to a massive movement of people out west, goods out west, and leads to refrigerated cars during the Gilded Age and be able to transport meat, and everything gets transported via the railroad. Big deal. Homestead Act, somebody mentioned this already, right? The government gives away land as long as you have a filing fee and you're able to improve the land. So many white settlers move out west. We have the Moral Land Grant Act, and that's going to give away land for states and for colleges and things like that. A lot of timber and mining out west, tuck that away for a little bit later, but there's going to be a lot of resource depletion and environmental problems out west as people continue to use up all the mining and using up all the timber without necessarily considering, what happens when we take away this entire hillside, things like that. Moral Land Grant Act, again, just a way for the government to give away more land. They use it for land grant colleges. So just another example of the government getting involved in the economy. They say, hey, Nebraska, why don't we give you some land and you can build a college on that? And then they can sell it or use it in a variety of different kinds of ways. So, yeah, Moral Land Grant Act, just another example of the United States giving away land, federal government getting involved. Don't forget we have people like exodusters moving out west, and they're going to be former slaves that move out west. They're able to somewhat participate in the Homestead Act, although to a limited extent. We have new inventions like the McCormick Reaper and barbed wire. So McCormick Reaper enables people to farm faster and more mechanically. Barbed wire is enabling farmers to fence off their property from ranchers. So thus the cowboys and the open range doesn't really last for that long. And then we have the Grange Movement, speaking of farmers. And this is where it starts to shift from, hey, there are farmers out west to, hey, there are farmers out west and they have problems and maybe we should address some of those. So the Grange Movement is going to be a collection of farmers trying to prevent each other from getting too bored, getting some solidarity. This is eventually going to morph into the Farmers Alliances and then into the People's Party and Populist Party. Dylan asks, can you draw some synthesis from the Homestead and Land Ordinance of 1785 in terms of the government organizing territory and getting involved in land consolidation? Yeah, I would say so. I mean, out west and Northwest Territory, somewhat similar, and especially in terms of promoting education, right? So promoting education by setting aside one section of land in the Northwest Territory with the Rural Land Grant Act. Sure, I'd say so. Again, the College Board is kind of moving away from the word synthesis. They don't like that too much. It's now complexity, and synthesis is one way to get the complexity. I'm not a huge fan of people trying. I find that if it's not integral to the essay and it doesn't really add a whole lot, it needs to be kind of an extended analysis. It's not really worth it, and you don't get the point. We generally don't give out complexity too much unless it's a really good essay. And I find the best way to do it is to sort of play both sides, right? The continuity and change, the cause and effect, the compare and contrast. That's usually the best way, in my mind, to be able to get to it. But you can always throw in some synthesis there to make it you sound a little smarter, which is awesome. People's Party and silver, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but remember the farmers want more inflation because they're in debt, and inflation helps people who are in debt. Ask me more about that later if you want to know more about that. We also have immigration and push pull factors and the unfortunate super racist cartoons about kicking out the Chinese with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we'll get there. So new immigrants from the Gilded Age. Where are these new immigrants from? If you think you know, go ahead and throw that into the chat as we stare into the face of Uncle Sam with shockingly red and blonde hair. Strawberry blonde, I guess. Let's see. So a lot of the new immigrants do come in through Ellis Island if they're coming down the East Coast, and Angel Island if they're coming from the West Coast. Germany and Ireland still are sending a lot of immigrants, but they wouldn't be considered new immigrants during the Gilded Age because they start during the 1830s and 40s, right? This is that was the antebellum era, right? So we're going to see a lot of people from China, Mexico, and Eastern and Southern Europe. So these are people like Jews and Polish people and Russians and Greeks and Italians and people that are considered less Anglo-Saxon and thus less white. The definition of white changes throughout American history. You already know this, right? The definition of white changes to be whatever the people in charge want it to be. And so at this point, people that were from Southern and Eastern Europe were not considered to be fully white and thus were viewed with suspicion. Part of it's the scary, scary Catholics things we've seen before with the Irish and the Germans. Part of it's fear of communism, but these are some new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. We're also going to see people coming from China, Japan, Mexico, as you all mentioned. This, unfortunately, is going to lead to some backlash. Nativism, a belief that native-born Americans, as in Americans born here before a certain arbitrary point, are somehow better, and xenophobia, the fear of outsiders, that's going to play a role as well. And then let's see, Dylan, what spurred Eastern European immigration? A lot of this is going to be connected with the Industrial Revolution and increased job opportunities in the United States. Some of it has to do with economic instability in Eastern Europe, especially if you're a Jew, you're going to be fleeing pogroms and other times when you're going to get persecuted. Otherwise, it's mass migrations of people as there's some chaos, Crimean War, etc., but also mostly economic opportunity during this time. Also keep in mind that a lot of these immigrants don't actually stay in the United States. I don't remember the exact specific stats on this, but a good percentage, I want to say close to a third of immigrants that come to the United States work here for a while and then come back. Fizz, if you would like the link to these slides, you have to be a 500 Plus subscriber, and they're linked on the website. So if you just go to this and watch the not in the live stream, but watch the archive later, this slide deck is all available there for you to click on. So xenophobia takes a variety of forms. Chinese Exclusion Act, probably the most infamous out of all of these. So the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. There's a question of assimilation. Assimilation means to become like. So, right, there are questions of, okay, there's these new immigrants. How do we make sure that they become true Americans? And there's always been that question in America, right? Oh, no, too many strange people. However will they fit in? And then, of course, America just morphs to become more welcoming and more multicultural, and it ends up not being that much of a problem. But there was a problem back then. Shouldn't laugh at it too much. They really did struggle with some of that stuff. And then, of course, there's also machine politics, which is tied in because there was the idea of machine politics is that, you vote for this person in exchange for goods and services, and this would often be tied in with immigrants. So some of the anti-immigrant sentiment goes with, well, they're part of political corruption. Think the Irish or the Germans with Boss Tweed, and in New York City, a lot of the Democratic Party is involved with that. And then in terms of push and pull factors, we also have women and children in the workforce. Oh, sorry, went a little bit too fast there. Women and children in the workforce is part of the Industrial Revolution, but it's also going to change how people work in the United States. It's going to change because we have some men coming over to be able to work, and then we also have women and children moving from farm areas, moving from the home into the city, into the factories. It's a little bit of a stretch to call it migration necessarily, but just work with me on this. All right, so then some practice questions. Again, if you have questions, now would be a good time to ask some of those. If you have questions, ask them in the thing down below in the chat. Some practice questions that just relate to that. Could you describe a specific reason for westward expansion? Could you describe a specific effect of westward expansion? And could you describe a specific response to changing immigration patterns? One of the things that I'd like to discuss specifically on this slide related to letter B that we didn't quite cover a whole lot in the previous couple of slides, and that is Native Americans. You got to remember that Native Americans are still there out west, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on with them in terms of broken treaties, in terms of the Homestead Act taking their land. There's things like Wounded Knee. There is the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Battle of the Greasy Grass. The Transcontinental Railroad, again, nice job, Fizz, leads to more settlers moving out west, which puts further pressure on Native Americans. You have things like the Dawes Act that are supposedly about protecting the Native Americans by giving them individual privatized ownership of land. Problem with that is that Native Americans didn't necessarily own land individually. It was often communal. Plus, they had to be migratory to be able to follow the bison on the Great Plains. And so giving them individual tracts of land really hurt them a whole lot. And that's a bit of a problem. So you should know things that tie in with the Homestead Act and with Native Americans. Again, the Wounded Knee Massacre kind of ends the Plains Wars and closes the frontier in 1890. So be aware of Native Americans. I might cover that a little bit later as the United States moves west. Let's see. So we have Transcontinental Railroad as an effective westward expansion. Could also be a cause, depends on how you use it. Mining boom, absolutely. Mining towns, Native American reservations, yes, absolutely. Let's see, cities getting too populated. West represented the opportunity to start over and strike it rich. Absolutely, that works. Dylan's going whole hog for the ace here. New opportunity for fertile farmland, grow crops and wheat like wheat in Kansas and mine minerals further west. Westward expansion, absolutely. And then dealing with the West and Native Americans. Excellent answer there. Last one, an effective westward expansion would be the displacement of Native Americans and forming the state of Oklahoma, originally called Indian Territory, right? That's where the Trail of Tears people were relocated to. Yes, that would do it. In letter C, if you want to talk about changing immigration patterns, you could talk about continued opposition to Chinese, to Southern and Eastern Europeans, and the Chinese Exclusion Act would probably be a really good one there. Yeah, I feel like we're doing a pretty good job there. Let's continue to move on a little bit. And if you have more questions, again, feel free to put those in there if we need them. So there are some cultural, economic, and social debates. Again, broad catch-all category for people disagreed over stuff during this time. On the right-hand side there, you can see a picture of tenements where it's very crowded. Urbanization is going to be a big deal during this time. So you should be able to explain things like the New South, increased economic opportunities during the Gilded Age and Period 6, be able to talk about reform movements and their response to the Gilded Age, as well as political parties and their responses. So this one has a little bit more. So we'll dive in. First one, the New South. The New South refers to the fact that after the Civil War, when the South got defeated by the United States, or the rebels, I should say, got defeated by the United States. There were, of course, loyalists down south still. But when the Confederacy got defeated by the United States, they realized, we didn't have a whole lot of factories or railroads or industry, and that made us kind of stink at the Civil War. Plus, we kind of need to get modernized to get into the modern age. Yet, we cannot abandon, as you can maybe see at the bottom there, King Cotton. So the New South, coined by Henry Grady, talks about how the South should industrialize while also keeping King Cotton. So this would be like Birmingham Steel Corporations and mining and factories, and yet also still having plantations. A couple things about that is, first of all, it still involves segregation. The New South is not going to be some sort of new, radically egalitarian place. You should know about Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. the Supreme Court case that says separate but equal and allows segregation to be equal. Again, remember the Gilded Age and period 6 overlaps with Reconstruction. So this period begins in 1865, ends in 1898 or so, this period specifically. And segregation is going to be a big thing after Reconstruction ends. So we move kind of from from black codes to Jim Crow laws. So be aware of Jim Crow laws, be aware of segregation, the Plessy decision, that's a part of the New South, that's a part of the Gilded Age. And then also, last but not least, we have convict leasing, a reminder that a lot of this cotton was picked by people that were doing sharecropping, that were tenant farmers, and then there's also this thing called convict leasing, which maybe should be a part of the loophole in the 13th Amendment. Remember, the 13th Amendment is, it says slavery is outlawed except for punishment of a crime, and convict leasing was where white Southern sheriffs could make up any excuse to arrest black people and then force them to work for no wages for local businesses, and they were often horribly treated. So the New South, it's going to be rather controversial, and it's going to involve a variety of people. Particularly, you can see there's child labor there. That's going to occur all over the United States, but this is industrialization down south. And you're going to get various responses. We'll talk about W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington a little bit later. Let's see. We had a question from Dylan. He said, do antebellum reform movements pick back up in the Gilded Age, like feminism, temperance, etc.? Absolutely. Yep, we're about to get to that, I believe, in a slide or two. So we'll come back to that. Great question. So next one, increased opportunity. Speaking of Booker T. Washington, here we go. So there is an increasing middle class during the Gilded Age. So people that are not extremely rich, not extremely poor. Again, remember the standard of living is increasing and we're getting more and more middle management. So there is an increasing middle class, thanks to managerial workers and other things too. The Tuskegee Institute, founded by this guy on the right-hand side, Booker T. Washington, that's trying to train up African Americans down south for these sorts of jobs that are sort of middle management. He wants people to advance economically so that way they can earn the social approval of white people. Remember, W.E.B. Du Bois disagrees about that and says, no, how about we have social equality right now? And he talks about the talented 10th. Booker T. Washington wants people to sort of be still segregated, but be able to work together economically. In his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, he talks about how in all things social, we can be as separate as the fingers. In all things economic, we can be as united as the fist, as the hand. So the Tuskegee Institute is a good example of people getting additional education and more training for new additional economic jobs. We have a new consumer culture that's going to involve things like camping, libraries, and the circus. There's just people get more and more involved as they have slight more amounts of leisure time sometimes, and possibly some more money as there's more of a middle class. So they start to do things like camping. Think about it. If you're in the middle of an industrial city, what do you want more than anything else? To get out of the city and maybe go to a park. Not really out of the city, but it feels like it. Or maybe you go camping. And this is the same time where we start to have first national parks, Yellowstone National Park in the 1870s, and other sorts of parks as people begin to say, oh, nature's disappearing as we cut all the trees down, and maybe we should do something about that so that way we can still go and have nature at some point. Libraries, again, we talked about Andrew Carnegie funding some of those, and circuses, think P.T. Barnum, etc. Consumer culture grows during the Gilded Age. And then reform movements' responses to the Gilded Age. Another bonus question for you here. Who is this lady? What is her name? And if you know that, what's she famous for? You probably can get that. She's a famous reformer during the Gilded Age and one of my personal heroes. She's fantastic. We're about 2 days away from Black History Month, but we can talk about her all the time because she's awesome. Oh, yeah, Dylan, you're so close. It's not Ida Tarbell. It's the other Ida. History of Standard Oil is Ida Tarbell. This is the other Ida. I'll give you a sec to write it down. Again, be thinking of questions that you might have, other things you want me to cover with period 6. Well, there's a second Ida. Muckrakers, journalists who try to expose corruption or dirty dealings and things like that. She's an example of one of those. Her name is Ida B. Wells Barnett. Ida B. Wells, she is a muckraking journalist who helps to expose and oppose lynching in the United States during this second. Oh, phew, I'm glad you've heard of her. Okay, good, Dylan. Yeah, the two different Idas, and I'd be ashamed of myself if I didn't mention both of them or do some sort of joke about it, because it's a fantastic name. But yes, Fizza, thank you very much for joining us. Yep, sorry to see you go, but hey, watch as much as you can. And yeah, good luck on your period 6 as you continue to go. So be aware that muckrakers start during the Gilded Age. We often associate muckrakers with the Progressive Era that kind of overlaps with the Gilded Age a little bit toward the end. But there are muckrakers during this time period. Ida B. Wells Barnett fights against lynching during this time. We have people like Thomas Nast who are drawing cartoons against Boss Tweed. We have people that are trying to make it better by exposing the nastiness of the Gilded Age and all the bad stuff that's happening, corruption, etc. There's also the social gospel. Remember that the people like Andrew Carnegie are going to use things like social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth to justify their huge amounts of money. They say, hey, I've earned it. I've worked hard. I deserve my money. Also, I'll give a bunch of it away, and you could do it too as long as you were as lucky. I mean, hardworking as I am, then you'd be fine. The social gospel kind of pushes back on that. The social gospel says, well, it's people like Walter Rauschenbusch. And they say, I go into the slums with bread in one hand and the Bible in the other hand. It's not just about saying, well, to paraphrase the gospel, right? It's not just about, well, keep warm and well fed. I hope you're okay, says the Apostle Paul. You shouldn't just do that, right? Instead, the social gospel is about actually helping people out, telling them about Jesus, and helping out with their physical needs. So Christians try to get involved in some of this reform movement stuff as well. This will later become a problem as some of the fundamentalists push back because they're like, well, you help the poor, but you don't necessarily have the right theology. And we'll see those problems in the 1920s. But for now, the social gospel is a religious expression. And Dylan, this kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. This would be an expansion or a continuation of the antebellum reform movements that are interested in using the Second Great Awakening and using religion in order to transform society. So that might be one way to look at it. We also have things like the WCTU, which only sounds like a radio station or television station. That is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So again, antebellum reform movements come roaring back. With the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, things like that, they are against alcohol. They're trying to prevent men from drinking so much, and they'll eventually become successful later on in the 20th century. But for now, we have other ones like NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Think Susan B. Anthony, etc. They're going to be women's rights. Again, antebellum reform movements come roaring back. So we have a lot of these that are going to be started during the Gilded Age that find most of their fulfillment or most of their success during the Progressive Era. All right. Oh, and I should remember Hull House. My wife is a social worker, and so the social work profession was started during this time, during the Gilded Age, by people like Jane Addams, who were in charge of things like Hull House. And Hull House was a so-called settlement house where they would help new immigrants. This was in Chicago. They would help new immigrants get settled. They would give them English classes. They would give them cooking lessons. They would connect them with people in the community, help them get housing. They might even help to fight corruption and try to do that. This is kind of early progressives. There's a little bit of an ambivalence here, a little bit of good and bad, because some of these people are going to say, well, immigrants, you're new here. Let me show you how it's done because your previous ways are kind of stupid and pat, really patronizing. But some of them do really intend to help a whole lot. And so there's a little bit of a two-sided nature to helping out that way. And then, as we already mentioned, machine politics in Tammany Hall. The Boss Tweed leads Tammany Hall, leads machine politics in New York City. He's the most famous example. And Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, takes him on, tries to take him down, expose the corruption. Then we got political parties and their responses. And you might notice on this cartoon, one of the most famous ones that we need to know during this time period is the People's Party. People's Party, otherwise known as the Populist Party. This cartoonist thinks it's a crazy party. Notice that the balloon is a party of patches, and then it says platform of lunacy, and they want a whole bunch of stuff that the cartoonist doesn't agree with. So the People's Party. This, remember, comes out of the Grange Movement and the Farmers' Alliances. It's largely farmers. Now, keep in mind, farmers are going to be in two places during this time period. Down south, think sharecroppers, and out west, think homesteaders. So the Populist Party or the People's Party gets very, very popular in the south and gets very, very popular in the west. They eventually get co-opted by largely race, because people are going to realize that, hey, this looks like, well, the people in charge are going to realize that it's a bunch of poor people uniting together, And if you've studied APUSH, you know about the racial bribe, perhaps, that happens with like Bacon's Rebellion. If poor people start to come together, just tell them, ooh, blacks and whites hate each other. And then the next thing you know, they're hating each other instead of you as the rich person. So that happens. So what does the Populist Party want? Well, remember, they're a bunch of disaffected, angry farmers who want things to get better for them. So they're going to be in charge of, they want the government to be in charge of things like regulating railroads. They don't have any other option as to where they go. They want the government to regulate railroads so the railroads can't charge too much. They also want the government to help them out with their crops because, remember, farmers all have to sell at the same time, which means it's the lowest possible price, and they want to be able to sell at a better time and a better price. Speaking of better price, they also want, they also want the free coinage of silver. Back in the day, the American dollar or dollar bills, greenbacks, were backed up by gold. And so you could go into a local bank, turn in a greenback, a dollar bill, and say, I want a dollar bill's worth of gold. Well, having to use gold limits the amount of money you can have in circulation because you're only supposed to have enough notes to correspond with the amount of gold you have. If you can add silver as a way to back the currency, you can issue more paper money. If there's more paper money, you don't need to be an economist to know this, if there's more paper money circulating, what's the value of each individual dollar? It goes down, and therefore prices go up in a process known as inflation. So the Populist Party wants inflation. Let me get through a couple of these things. So one of the big questions is, do we use gold as the backing of our currency or gold and silver? The bankers, the rich people, want only gold because that preserves the value of money and it's helpful to them. People that are debtors want gold and silver because that way there's inflation and it helps them. This gets a little bit confusing and a little bit wonky. I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, but let me just briefly try to explain this. If you, take out a $100 loan to buy a tractor, and then inflation happens so that everything costs more, you still owe $100, even though if you were to buy a tractor the next day, maybe it would cost $110. So you're selling your crops for more, and yet your loan stays the same. So if you owe money, inflation is nice because the amount you owe doesn't go up. I mean, interest is a thing, obviously, but the amount you owe basically is the same, while you get to make more money on perhaps your salary or perhaps the amount of money you're getting from selling crops. So the Populist Party is all about currency wars. People like William Jennings Bryan arguing for this, the famous Cross of Gold speech, the crime of 73, when the government decided not to do more coinage of silver. Republicans and Democrats, there's not a lot of huge, big, interesting differences between the Republicans and the Democrats that you absolutely have to know for APUSH. There are differences. If you're super curious, I can recommend a really good book, The Republic for Which It Stands by Richard White, all about the United States in Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. Very lengthy tome, but very interesting. Talks about some of those differences there, the mugwumps and all those kinds of people, all sorts of fun names, the stalwarts, etc. But for our purposes, you should know that they differ on tariffs. Republicans like tariffs, Democrats don't. There's also that Civil War legacy where the Republicans say, hey, vote for us, because the Democrats, they're the party of treason and secession, and you shouldn't vote for them because they caused the Civil War. That was known as waving the bloody shirt, as in, look at them, they caused all this bloodshed. Democrats, by contrast, would say, Civil War is over, get over it. Also, we're still in charge of the South, and we're because after Reconstruction ends, right, with redemption, and we're definitely going to keep all of the black people from voting, so the Democrats are in charge of the South. In terms of which side they take with like industrialization, Republicans start to become the party of big business by the end of the Gilded Age, but that's very much at the very end. So there are other issues at play, and there's not a whole bunch of huge differences you must know between the parties right now. Look them up if you want some details there later, but I wouldn't be too worried about that. And then one of the big changes politically is the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It's trying to end patronage. Garfield gets shot by a person who wants to get a job from him, kind of Andrew Jackson style. And so the government goes, well, we shouldn't really have people getting shot over jobs. So how about we give people jobs based on whether they're qualified, merit, over whether they gave lots of money or they happen to be friends with someone. That clearly works out, and the United States never has any problems with that ever again, he said sarcastically. Obviously, that still happens in politics today, but it was an attempt at making things better, an attempt at reform that you should be a little bit aware of. By the way, in case you're curious, fantastically written book. It's called Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard, all about the assassination of Garfield and its aftermath. Fantastic, reads like a novel. One of the best books you'll ever read. Very good. 10 out of 10. So, some short answer questions. And meanwhile, you can ask me some questions. Ooh, almost fell down there. You can ask me some questions if you need to. Just need to stretch a little bit. And stay hydrated, right? You want to make sure you're staying hydrated as you do your APUSH work. So I'll put up some short answer questions. You can go ahead and answer them in the chat. Otherwise, you can ask questions down below. Ask questions in the chat as well. Here are 3 ones for you. A specific change in U.S. politics from 1865 to 1900. I wrote that broad enough that it can include Reconstruction, so feel free. A specific change in the lives of African Americans during this time. Again, includes Reconstruction, but could also include other things. And then C, a response to changing immigration patterns. So this could be nativism of various sorts. This could be machine politics. A lot of different kinds of options. Let me leave it up there for a little bit, just so you can look at them, so you can think of some answers. So you can type down some answers, so you can ask some additional questions if you need to. Want to make sure we have enough time for people to get their questions answered. Again, if you have sort of a big, broad question that doesn't directly relate, put it in the question box down below. Otherwise, we're doing really well. We're getting toward the end of this stream, about 5 minutes left or so. So got a couple of images for you, as well as a chance for you to ask more questions and answers. So, questions, concerns about period 6, about APUSH in general, go ahead and throw those in. Now would be a good time. In the meanwhile, let's look at some cartoons and look at some images. So, vocab association. You see this. This is the Standard Oil octopus. Do you have some vocab that you might be able to associate with this? I'm thinking here maybe Rockefeller, because he owns Standard Oil. Let's see. We might also talk about horizontal integration, because Standard Oil owns all of the refineries. And notice how they're grabbing for the state house, the U.S. Capitol, the White House. They're grabbing other competitors and strangling them. It's taking over everything. Dylan's mentioning this to Muckrakers, absolutely, with Ida Tarbell, right? She exposes how Standard Oil is stifling competition, eventually leads it to get broken up into multiple companies, ones that we still know today like Texaco, Marathon, BP, etc. All used to be part of Standard Oil. So be aware that this time period has a lot of visuals, a lot of political cartoons, a lot of interesting charts related to new inventions, immigration, etc. Be aware of some of those as you go. This one, called The Protectors of Our Industries. Let's see. Dylan was answering the previous question about a change in U.S. politics. Yeah, Grange Movement, Omaha Platform, Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan. Yeah. That's good stuff. Just a reminder, and you didn't necessarily not do this because you ended up using a lot of good vocab words. But remember that it's almost always a good idea to choose one specific vocab word and then define it and just continue to talk about that rather than listing a whole bunch. So it might be a better idea maybe to say something like, well, if you were just going to run with the Grange Movement or something like that, you said after the Grange Movement and the Omaha Platform, so that was perfectly fine. But if one wanted to just mention one of those, then one could define it a whole bunch more. Just an idea for other people who maybe don't know all of those. So this political cartoon right here is criticizing the rich people, right? Because as hard times, which you can see in the back, you can see hard times barely probably right there. Use the pointer a second. Right there in the back. And then also down here, right next to the hammer and sickle. Ooh, a little bit of communism going on. As the hard times go up a little bit and the tide rises, it hurts the workers first, but not the fat cats who are literally made out of suits of money and are sitting on more money, and they're not paying their workers a whole lot. So this would be a pro-labor cartoon. We have this one. This one is the famous Boss Tweed cartoon, The Brains, that achieved the Tammany victory at the Rochester Democratic Convention, written by, of course, Thomas Nast. You might recognize his style if you see it again. Otherwise, Thomas Nast is a very famous cartoonist, and in this case, he's talking about Boss Tweed being the money bags. How does he control politics and machine politics? Through money, through bribery, and money makes politics go round. So just be aware of some of those things. We have this one. This is one of the first, this is the insurance company building in Chicago, one of the first skyscrapers. Be aware that urbanization happens during this time period. Tenement apartments become a thing. People are living in crowded conditions, often in ghetto-like conditions, not the ghetto in the modern sense, but ghetto in the original sense, as in people are confined to smaller neighborhoods, often very ethnically homogenous. All the Polish people tend to cluster together. All the Dutch people cluster together. They speak their native languages. They have their stores. We get Chinatown, Little Italy, stuff like that. As urbanization increases, there's also a lot of dirt and mess and pollution and crowdedness. Tenement conditions are not great. And so that's going to lead to eventually the progressive era as people try to solve some of these problems. All right. If you don't have any more questions for me, we're about out of time here and starting to wrap up. So a reminder that if you're looking for more 5.0 content, we're Thursdays at 9 p.m. We're going to do some more deeper dives going forward into some specific period 7 topics. This one was just on period 6, kind of an overview, hitting some highlights there for you. If you have any more questions, now would be the time. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you again on another 5.0 stream. Best of luck, especially those of you that are taking a period 6 test sometime soon. Dylan, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. I always appreciate an active person in the chat, and you're one of the most active, of course, so nice job. Good to have a better grasp on period 6. Period 6 is kind of a monster. Like it just feels like it's all over the place, and it's hard to get a good grasp of how it all connects together. And so, yeah, hopefully we put some of that together. Remember the growth of industry, the movement out west, and then all sorts of problems and controversies that come along with that, along with opportunities and new good things. So, yeah, one way to look at it. Alrighty. Well, folks, have a fantastic evening. And again, hope your rest of your APUSH goes well. And we'll see you again sometime soon. Good night.